See, there's one, and I'll get Buck the other one. There's 4, and you got 5. There we go. Yeah, one's 4 and one's 5. We're at the end of 4 and fixing to start 5. Is that 4 or 5, Buck? You got? Let me have one of those, would you? Thank you. Yeah, you had 4 last week if you still got it. If you need another 4, then he's got it. If you had 4, you might have had 4 last week. We were doing 4 last week, if you're one of the people that's able to keep up with things. It's not always me. Just laying that down on you. And then Keith's got number 5. Keith's got the next one. All right, so we were in this a little bit last week and started talking, got almost to the end of this actually, but not quite. So we can kind of look back a little bit at some of the stuff that we looked at last week. This is Israel under the United Kingdom. So this is about the extent, the largest extent of what Israel ever had landmass-wise under their possession. And this is after, of course, you had the division, 12 tribes and their division of land. You know, you can kind of see that Ephraim and Manasseh were 2 of the biggest on there, if you can see that. I don't know how good you can see that. We can turn that light off and maybe you can see it a little better. But their land, at the time of the greatest extent, it was well north of the Dead Sea, well south of the Dead Sea, well north of the Sea of Galilee. It also extended to the east of the Jordan. You can see the Jordan going between the Sea of Galilee and the Dead Sea there. It extended well to the east of that area because Manasseh and Gad, some of those tribes wanted that land, which actually we consider that kind of the desert land. This was kind of the greatest extent of the kingdom of Israel under Solomon. And so when Israel or Jews look for that to come back, that's kind of what they're looking towards, is that type of a land, of a landmass. Now, you know, today, I mean, Judah's just right there, right today, and I should have probably showed you a map of what it is today, but, you know, Israel's a little bitty today, right there around Jerusalem. It's not very big, not a very big area today in there. And, you know, as we talk about this kingdom getting divided, that's why we call them the northern tribes from, you know, Benjamin up. And Benjamin kind of hung in there with Judah. But we call that the northern tribes or northern Israel. And then Judah, southern Israel, or the southern tribe of Judah. And so in the Bible, in the Old Testament, sometimes when we speak of Israel, we speak of that entirety. And then as time goes on, and of course the northern tribes are carried off by the Assyrians and the southern Judah is what's left. And then towards the New Testament, we talk of Israel, but really we're not talking about, you know, all of that. We're not talking about all those tribes. We're just talking about the southern tribes. So we're just really talking about Judah and that kind of how that transgresses over time. We talked some last time, kind of reviewing a little bit in 4. You know, Saul didn't follow God's command, right? He didn't wait for Samuel to offer a sacrifice, right? Saul didn't wait for that to happen. Saul decided he would offer it, and in doing that, he angered God. He angered Samuel. Samuel was really put out. Why didn't you wait for me? And yet he refused to do that. And the Lord sought out a man after his own heart, right? That's what he told. He said, I'm going to seek out a man after my own heart. And of course we know that would be David, right? And it says, Samuel anointed David as king, and the Holy Spirit of the Lord came mightily upon him from that day forward. And David was told that the sword would never depart from his house. So after David had a sin with Bathsheba, God basically through Nathan said, because of this, the sword will never depart from your house. That's one reason that David would not be allowed to build a temple, was because David's house was a house of blood. David's house was because of that, because of David's transgressions. So talked a little bit about that last time. Solomon was the son to David and Bathsheba, and the Lord loved him. Your son Solomon shall be king after me and shall sit on my throne. 2 Samuel 7 is called a dualistic prophecy. Talked about that last time. It's all talking about Solomon, but it's also talking about Christ, and we spent some time on that last time. And he says, a descendant from David will build a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. So this is really a big, big prophecy. And like I said, on one hand, we're talking about Solomon. Solomon's going to build a house for the name of God. He's going to build Solomon's temple, which is a grand temple. But on the other hand, it's Jesus Christ who will sit on the throne of David, who will build a house, the church, for the name of Jesus, and that will be established forever. So we talked to that we call that a dualistic prophecy. And we talked about that quite a bit last time. But what happens now is the kingdom is going to be divided. So when Solomon took over the kingdom, his advisors came to him and basically told him, they said, if you'll drop the taxes, lower the taxes on the people, and you'll make it easier on him, the people will follow you. But of course, God had already decided to divide this kingdom. God had already decided he was going to rip the kingdom out of his hand. So he didn't listen to that counsel, and he even taxed the people heavier. And because of that, the kingdom would become divided. The Israelites persisted in all the sins of Jeroboam, did not turn away from them until the Lord removed them from his presence, as he had warned through all his servants, the prophets. So the people of Israel were taken from their homeland into exile in Assyria, and they are still there. So in about 520 BC, Assyrians came in, and the Assyrians, they basically carried all of Israel away. They carried them off into captivity, and they're what we call the lost tribes. That's the northern part of the kingdom, the 10 tribes. The reason we say 10 tribes is because Benjamin was under the tail of Judah. So even though we just say the 10 tribes, Benjamin wasn't really one of the ones we consider to be carried away. So these tribes, the Assyrian captivity is something they would never come back from. They would never be returned to their land. Assyrian captivity was permanent. They carried them away. They carried them away from the land. They would never come back. They've never come back. And that's the Samaritans, right, in Jesus' day. The Samaritans are those half-bloods, those half Assyrians, half Jews that were remaining. And that's the reason they didn't care for them. They didn't like them because they were actually carried away. And they were carried away into this and never heard from them. So we call them the lost tribes. And they eventually they wound up all through Europe, all through, all basically just scattered. Because the Assyrians carried all the ones they wanted off, which is the same thing the Babylonians did. But the Assyrians, because of the way that worked, the Assyrians got scattered, and those tribes never ever came back. So it really complicates things, okay? Because when we talk about Old Testament prophecy, and we talk about God restoring Israel, the Jews are looking for him to restore all of Israel. Not just Judah, but all of Israel. So that means by some miraculous event, if this is proper, if that's the way you look at this prophecy, by some miraculous event, God's going to separate all of Israel, all of them that got carried off, all them people back and bring them back into this kingdom. This is a long time ago. These people are, I don't know how we'd find these people. I guess DNA, right? I mean, this is a long, long time ago. These people were carried off and have never were heard from again. We call them the lost tribes. That's why we call them that, because they're lost to antiquity. They just intermingled with these other groups, these other nationalities, these other races, to the point that they're no longer their own people. There's no distinction in them anymore. So that makes it really, really difficult in the Old Testament when God says, I'm going to restore Israel. Because when I think of Israel, off the cuff, and probably when you think of Israel off the cuff, we really think about Israel today. We think about that little country over there in the Middle East that's always fighting everybody. That's really not Israel. Do you understand what I'm saying? That's just a nation that we decided after World War II we were going to steal all that land from the Palestinians and give it to the Jews. I mean, it's really if you really know the history of all that, it's really a messed up deal, I don't know how else to say it. It's a messed up deal over there. And when we think about Israel today, that's what we think about. We think about that. But that's really not what this is, I guess is the best way to say it. It's really not the same thing. So if you look at 1 Kings 11, it says, he said to Jeroboam, take 10 pieces for yourself, and for this is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. See, I'm going to tear the kingdom out of Solomon's hand and give you the 10 tribes. But for the sake of my servant David and the city of Jerusalem, which I have chosen out of the tribes of Israel, he will have one tribe. So the tribe of Judah is what God's going to preserve. Now I know Benjamin's kind of in there, but you just never hear about them again. They just kind of fade into the mass. Because Benjamin was the smallest tribe anyway, so there wasn't a lot of them to start with. And they just kind of fade into this whole system. So what you wind up with is Judah. That's what you wind up with. So when we get to Jesus' time, it's kind of interesting because when Jesus was in the temple, right, and he goes to be dedicated to the temple, and there were, and Anna was there, remember, and Simon, and they were of different tribes, right? So there were members of other tribes that didn't get carried off. But predominantly, at the time of Jesus, that was just Judah, okay? Just Judah. So when we talk about Israel in the New Testament, we're not talking about all of Israel, like all of the 12 tribes of Israel. We're talking about Judah. So this changes in this scheme of things. This changes. And so that's what's originally going to go away. But interesting, if you go back to Genesis 49, and the last question on this, in Genesis 49:10, the scepter will not depart. That idea of that being that kingdom, that idea of that kingdom is going to be in Judah. So when this kingdom divides, this is what you wind up with. You wind up with the northern kingdom. And it's going to exist like this for quite a while. I mean, this isn't going to happen in a day. It's going to exist like this for a long period of time. And in the Bible, in the Old Testament, you have northern kingdom and southern kingdom prophets. You have Elijah, Elisha, those guys in 1 Kings and 2 Kings, those are northern kingdom prophets. Those guys are prophesying to the northern kingdom. You have southern kingdom prophets. Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, basically all the minor prophets for the most part, are all southern kingdom prophets. They're later, okay, because the southern kingdom is going to continue to exist, and the northern kingdom is going to cease to exist. So basically, this is what happened. Now, one reason that Jerusalem and the southern kingdom survived is because countries really didn't want that land. I mean, it wasn't just because they were strong or tough, because they could have got conquered a lot of times. The problem is that if you've ever looked at that land around Jerusalem and that area, Golan Heights, West Bank, all of that land is very rocky and hilly. It's not really fertile land. That northern kingdom stuff was a lot better land. Matter of fact, if you read the Old Testament, and God didn't want them to have chariots, like Solomon didn't want Solomon to have chariots. And one reason I think that God did that was because God didn't want them going off and conquering land that chariots would be effective in battle. The land around Judah, chariots weren't really effective because it was hilly and rocky and it just wasn't really made for that type of warfare. To the north, there were more flat ground, more open ground. We talk about the plain of Megiddo, all that stuff was more open and flat, and that was more chariot warfare territory in the north. So there's a lot of factors here, military factors, land factors, border factors. A lot of stuff goes on in the Old Testament, how God protected this southern kingdom from what was going to happen in the north. So if you really look at how this works, I wish you could see this better. Maybe you can. You can see that pretty good. So if you really see how this works, Rehoboam is Solomon's son. Rehoboam should have been king over all of Israel. But because Rehoboam taxed the people and made it hard on them, the commander, Jeroboam, revolts and takes 10 tribes with him. That's how it separates. Then you have two kingdoms. At this particular point, we call them the kingdom of Israel and the kingdom of Judah. You have two particular kingdoms, and that splits. The kingdom of Israel will be carried off to Assyrian captivity in 721 BC. So in 721, 700 years before Jesus, you see this is a long time, right? 700 years before Jesus, they're going to get carried off by the Assyrians, never to return. Elijah and Elisha are your two big northern kingdom prophets. That's why I so love these guys. Because these guys were preaching to people who were never going to repent. I mean, these guys were preachers that people wouldn't listen to. I mean, they had the toughest job of any prophet in the Bible, probably. They were proclaiming God to people who just didn't care. And yet they did it, you know? And I think that's why I think so much about those two guys. And they don't have their own books, right? You got to go to 1st and 2nd Kings, 1st and 2nd Chronicles, read about Elijah and Elisha. But they were northern kingdom guys that were prophesying to Israel, telling them to turn, to repent. Of course, that's not going to happen. Eventually, they're going to get overrun. And then a couple hundred years later, actually, this says 606, but actually about 586, somewhere in there, is when it actually fell. Now, it's kind of a complicated story because the Babylonians came in and kind of made a deal with them and kind of did and kind of didn't, and it rocked on for a bunch of years, and then eventually the king of Judah decided that he was going to stand up to them, and he thought the king of Egypt would come up and rescue him. And he was pretty convinced of that, but the king of Egypt didn't come up and rescue him. And the Babylonians seized the city and tore it down and tore down the temple and took all the stuff back to Babylon. That's Daniel, all right? That's the days of Daniel. That's the days of your captivity prophets. Ezekiel, Isaiah, Jeremiah. Daniel was a captivity, right? Daniel was in Babylon. Daniel was written from Babylon. Daniel was in Babylon, and then the comeback, right, which was Ezra and Nehemiah, bringing the stuff back to Jerusalem. So what happens is that Assyria carried them off and they were gone, never heard from them again. But what happened with Babylon is that the Babylons, about 70 years, a little over 70 years after they conquered and took Judah away, the Medes and the Persians came in. And the Medes and the Persians were so powerful that the Babylonians didn't even resist. They just opened the gate and said, here we are, because they knew they couldn't win. So the Medes and the Persians came in. You remember Esther? You remember Esther? Xerxes, he was a Persian, a Mede. So the Medes and the Persians, that's the shift in Daniel, right? Daniel starts out with Nebuchadnezzar. Remember that? You know, Nebuchadnezzar, right? And in the middle of Daniel, or towards the end of Daniel, we change kings. Remember the handwriting on the wall, and he says, your kingdom's not going to stand. And that night, the Medes came in, and they killed him, and they took the kingdom. But the problem, what happened is the Medes and the Persians, when they came in, Xerxes, they said there was two different philosophies. The Babylonians wanted to make everybody Babylonian. So they carried all the Jews that were worth anything, they carried them off. They left all the ones they didn't want in Jerusalem in the grotto. That's where Jeremiah writes Lamentations. After they're carried off and Jerusalem's destroyed, and Jeremiah is sitting in the rubble in Jerusalem, and he writes Lamentations because Jerusalem's destroyed. They've carried everybody to Babylon. That was Daniel, Meshach, Shadrach, Abednego. All them people they wanted, they carried them. They give them Babylonian names, right? They changed their name. Daniel became Belshazzar, right? Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were Babylonian names. They changed their name. They changed their diet. That's what the book of Daniel's about. They wanted to make them good Babylonians. But when the Medes came in, the Medes basically said, if you want to go home, go home. You know, if you want to go back, go back. We don't care. And they even helped them. They even gave them like the articles of the temple. They even gave them military support to go back to Jerusalem. So Ezra and Nehemiah, they pack everything up. Well, Ezra, first he goes back and he starts to rebuild the temple. Then Nehemiah goes back, starts to rebuild the walls. That's the books of Ezra and Nehemiah. They're going back under the Medes and they're rebuilding the temple. That's the second temple. Okay, so Solomon's temple is the first temple. Solomon's temple stands till the Babylonians conquer it, basically 486 BC. Babylonians are going to conquer it, tear it all to the ground, carry all the articles of the temple back to Babylon. And then when Ezra and Nehemiah come along under the Medes, they're going to get all those articles, all that stuff they stole, they're carrying all that back to Jerusalem, and they're going to rebuild the temple, they're going to rebuild the wall, and they're going to reestablish Jerusalem. That's the second temple. But what happens after that is that temple is kind of put together. It ain't like Solomon's temple, right? Solomon's temple was like the Taj Mahal. The second temple was more like a Holiday Inn, right? It wasn't nothing like it. So then what happens is a few years before Jesus comes along, Herod comes in and says, I'm going to build a new temple. So Herod comes in and he starts to redo the whole temple, which is still under construction when Jesus is on the earth. The actual temple wouldn't be completed until about 20 or 30 years after Jesus was actually crucified. Temple was still under construction when Jesus was here. They were still building it. And that, we call that Herod's temple. But Herod's temple is a reconstruction of the second temple. All this stuff's going on. So anyway, they're carried off. And then these guys, Ezekiel, he's a captivity prophet. Most of these big prophets are captivity prophets. Ezekiel, Isaiah, Daniel was from Babylon. Ezra and Nehemiah returning back. A lot of your minor prophets were about captivity. They're captivity prophets. Jeremiah, Lamentations. All those prophets are basically captivity prophets that either are before or during or after, directly after Babylonian captivity. And the Babylonians are going to carry them off. And they're going to carry them off to Babylon, and the kingdom's basically going to kind of get divided. So there's a lot of history. There's a lot of history going on here. But Genesis 49:10, it says the scepter, and this is way back in Genesis, so we're backing up a little bit. It says the scepter will not depart from Judah, nor the ruler's staff from between his feet, until he to whom it belongs shall come, and the obedience of the nations shall be his. So way back in Genesis, we're tagging Judah. Way back in Genesis 49, we're tagging Judah to be the tribe. And then we get to 2 Samuel 7, which we looked at. We get to 2 Samuel 7, we're tagging not just Judah, but we're tagging David's lineage. So we're narrowing it down. Who's going to be Christ? Who's the Messiah? Where's the Messiah going to come from? Well, way back in Genesis, we talk about the scepter. That's the ruler's scepter. You remember in Esther, the book of Esther, when Esther's going to go in, remember, and she's scared, and she says, if he doesn't extend his staff to me, I'll be killed, right? In other words, if I walk into there and he doesn't extend that staff, that's the scepter. That was the power of the ruler. He says, if he doesn't extend that staff to me, I'll be killed, right? Because I'm not invited. That's the scepter. The scepter will not depart from what? From the tribe of Judah, nor the ruler's staff from between his feet. So if you really start to look at how this fits together, you got to go all the way back to Genesis to see that it's Judah. We get to 2 Samuel 7, and we know it's the tribe. We know it's the lineage of David, and we start to narrow down where the Messiah has to come from and how this is all going to work. So when you look at your Bible, I said this last week, and I think it's so important we understand this. You know, Jesus didn't start in Matthew. I mean, that's the best way I know to tell you. This was from ancient. This was a ton of prophecy. This was from ancient times. And it all has to fit together. So that kind of gets us up to here. We're kind of going to back up a little bit, talk about a little bit of this, and then we'll kind of start to move into Jesus just a little bit. Are there any comments? Well, Levi was a priestly tribe, so they were scattered throughout, which was kind of interesting because they didn't have a land. They had cities of refuge. So the tribe of Levi was scattered throughout all of that. So even though all of the northern gets carried off, the temple's in Jerusalem, so the priests, the priests that are serving are in Jerusalem, because there's divisions of priests, right? There's a lot of Levites. So they rotated. Everybody had a certain time that your family, your whatever served. So even when Israel, what happened, well, that's really something I should have brought up too, Keith. I'm glad you said that. Let me back up a little bit. I'll show you something. Because this kind of gets, maybe I can show you here. Nope. Let me see if I can show you back here. That's a good point. I should have brought that up. So what happens is, well, might not be able to show you on that either. You might just have to take my word for it. What happened is that when the tribes, when it split, then the Israelite tribes, the northern tribes, would not go to the temple to worship. They would not do that anymore because they were two separate nations. So what happened was, when the Hebrew nation came over the Jordan River into the Promised Land, they crossed the Jordan, right? And when they did, they came to a town, an ancient town. If you look at it in the Old Testament, sometimes it's called Sychar, but we call it Shechem. And they came across to Shechem. And if you study about them crossing into the Promised Land, when they crossed over into Shechem, there were two mountains. There was Mount Ebal, Mount Gerizim, that they had to go between these two mountains. Shechem was in the valley between Mount Ebal and Mount Gerizim. And the priests stood one on each mountain. One shouted blessings, one shouted curses. Shechem is really important. That's where, you remember Joseph said, don't leave my bones in Egypt, right? Remember that? You ever seen the Ten Commandments and they're all packing Joseph? And I kind of think it's kind of funny because they packed Joseph for 40 years. But I just can't imagine that. Get up every day. Well, we're going to pack Joseph, 40 years. But they packed Joseph around the wilderness for 40 years. And when they cross over into the Promised Land, they bury him in Shechem. And that's also, previous to that, that's where Jacob dug his well. Remember that thing about Jacob's well? So Jacob's well's in Shechem. Joseph's buried in Shechem. Mount Gerizim and Mount Ebal's in Shechem. In John chapter 3, where Jesus is talking to the woman at the well, remember what she says? She says, they say we should worship in this mountain, and you say we should worship in Jerusalem, right? The mountain is Gerizim. They worshiped on an altar on Gerizim instead of Jerusalem. So there were priests in the northern tribe, but the northern tribe was influenced by the Assyrians, and their religion became kind of watered down, essentially. It was kind of Assyrian and Israelite. And that's why the Jews hated him. Jews hated him because they didn't worship in Jerusalem. And Jesus said, there'll come a day and time when neither in this mountain or in Jerusalem will you mountain, but Jesus, God seeks those who worship in spirit and truth, right? And what Jesus was saying is, he said, it's coming a time where it won't matter. But she said, we worship in this mountain, Gerizim. You worship in Jerusalem, temple. So that got split. So the temple was still in existence. The Levites were still performing the duties. There was still a sacrifice being made. All those things were going on. But at the same time, in the northern kingdom, they had priests sacrificing on Gerizim. So there was a split worship here. So that's something I probably didn't bring up, but that's a really good point. And the Levites, since the Levitical tribe didn't have since the Levitical tribe never had a land, they had cities of refuge, so they were scattered throughout the Promised Land. If you look right here, there's no Levi, okay? What's really interesting, if you really look at this map, what I think is interesting, is that you remember I said Joseph, you never see Joseph, right? Because Joseph had two sons, and his two sons got the inheritance, Ephraim and Manasseh. And if you really look at this, look how big, because these land masses are according to population. So the bigger the tribe, the bigger the land mass. That's how it was divided up when they went into the promised land. And if you look at this, look at how big the tribe of Manasseh was by the time they entered the promised land. Ephraim, see how big Ephraim? Ephraim's right there. See Manasseh? And so you've got, see Dan, little bitty Dan, you know, and Asher. See Zebulun up there, little bitty Zebulun, you know. Benjamin, you see Benjamin right there, sandwiched between Ephraim and Judah, a little bitty Benjamin. You know, Benjamin's a little bitty, right there on the edge of Judah. So it really shows you how big Ephraim and Manasseh, though. It always amazed me, you know, Joseph's not there, like I said, because Ephraim and Manasseh gets it. There's no Levi land, there's no Levitical land mass. So because of that, the priests got scattered into both halves, but it's just kind of interesting how it panned out in the end, you know, land mass wise. And then eventually, of course, that's gonna get conquered. So anyway, it's kind of interesting, I think. Any more comments? Huh? Oh. So let's go a little New Testament here for a minute. A little bit. So in Matthew 5, Jesus says, "Do not think that I came to abolish the law of prophets. I did not come to abolish, but to fulfill." So when we look at not just the prophetic, it's really important what Jesus said. We think about prophecy, messianic prophecy. Jesus came to fulfill prophecy. Jesus said, "I didn't just come to fulfill prophecy. I came to fulfill the law." That's a big thing when Jesus says that, because they really kind of consider Jesus to be kind of a lawbreaker, not a law fulfiller. And Jesus says, "I'm coming to fulfill this law." So when we look at all this, Jesus is this is really a fulfillment. And you really got to look at this next stuff we're going to study and think about what Jesus had to do, who he had to be, how he had to live, what he had to do to make all this Old Testament stuff happen, right? Because he had to make the Old Testament, he had to fulfill this law. He had to fulfill this prophetic utterance. So we start to look at the Messiah, right? So the first thing we think about with Jesus is Bethlehem. Right? That's what we think of when we first think about Jesus. This is a really interesting prophecy. And the reason it's interesting is because I don't know the Jews really thought this was Jesus' prophecy. So you and I, we've grown up with this. I mean, we've heard this since the time we were born. We've sang the songs, right? I mean, we've sang the songs at Christmas time. We've done this since we were born. We believe this. We grew up with this. The problem is it's out of Isaiah, and the problem with this prophecy, if you remember right, in Samuel, I said in 2 Samuel 7, we consider that a dualistic prophecy, because on one hand it's talking about Solomon, but on the other hand it's talking about Jesus. It's kind of easy to see that prophecy is dualistic, because part of it cannot be fulfilled by Solomon, okay? That's why it makes it easier, because when Nathan says, your kingdom will be established forever, that can never be Solomon. That's impossible, can never happen. So we know when we look at that prophecy, and the Jews know when they looked at that prophecy, that we were talking about Jesus, because we're talking about the Messiah, because one person in Solomon could never accurately fulfill that prophetic statement. The problem with Isaiah 7, which is where this comes from, the problem with Isaiah 7 is that this, in and of itself, was not messianic. So what this is about a king. This is not about, Jesus said, "I'm going to deliver them into your hands," and he said, "I'm going to give you a sign." He said, "I don't want a sign." He said, "I'm going to give you a sign anyway." In the Hebrew, it says the young maiden will conceive a child. It doesn't say virgin. In the Hebrew language, It says a young maiden will conceive. So it doesn't say virgin in the Hebrew text. So that's one problem with Isaiah. And I'm not trying to cause problems. I always thought it was kind of interesting because it shows you the power of the New Testament word. And what I mean by that, so there's a lot of Old Testament books, Old Testament stuff, that people want to deny, okay? In other words, let's take Job. No, let's take Jonah. Let's take Jonah. Jonah is one of them Old Testament books that is pretty hard to believe, right? I mean, I'm just being honest about it. I mean, I've been on the water my whole life. I've seen a lot of big fish. I'm not saying God can't do it. I mean, don't get me wrong. I'm not trying to deny the Word of God. I'm just saying Jonah is one of them stories, if you just read it, you'd be like, oh, that's a Paul Bunyan tale, right? I mean, that could be a Paul Bunyan tale. It could be a good message, right? It could be like a good lesson, but it didn't really happen. You see what I'm saying? And a lot of people think of Jonah that way. A lot of the Jews thought of Jonah that way. They thought Jonah, which Jonah's a real prophet. Don't get me wrong. Jonah appears before the book of Jonah. Jonah's a real, honest-to-God prophet. No doubt about that. But when we start talking about the story of Jonah, what happens, right? God says, number one, he says, go to Nineveh. Well, Nineveh is an enemy of the Jews, right? That's our greatest enemy, Nineveh. The last thing any Jew wants to do is save Nineveh. I mean, that's the last thing they want to do. And the first thing it says is go to Nineveh, which no good Jew would ever want to go to Nineveh. And of course, Jonah does the thing, right? He runs off, and the fish swallows him, and he's in the belly of the fish for 3 days and 3 nights. Now, I'm not saying that can't happen, and I'm sure it did. I'm fine with it. I believe it did. I'm going to tell you why I believe it did. But just to listen to that story on the outside, that sounds like a tall tale, doesn't it? I mean, how are you going to live in a fish? I mean, what are you going to breathe? What are you going to eat? What are you going to drink? You know, how are you going to live with all that gastrointestinal fluid trying to eat you away while you're in the belly, you know? And I know we think about Geppetto, right, where he's in there with his little table and his lamp, and, you know, when we think about Pinocchio, but I'm sure Jonah didn't have a table or a lamp or a chair. Jonah's just washing around. I don't know how that works. And then somehow this fish miraculously finds the right shore and vomits Jonah out on the shore. And Jonah's all right. Jonah's none the worse for wear, right? Jonah jumps out, walks to Nineveh. That's a pretty good walk if you look at it, right? It took him probably 7, 8 days to walk to Nineveh. And you think, well, that's a crazy story, right? But then when the New Testament comes along and they're questioning Jesus, and they say, we want a sign. And Jesus says, an evil and adulterous situation seeks for a sign, but none will be given it but the sign of Jonah. As Jonah was 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of the great fish, as it says, not whale, in the belly of the great fish, so will the Son of Man be 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of the earth. And when Jesus says it, it makes it true. Does that make any sense? Because we know Jesus is credible. And if Jesus relates his story to Jonah's story, then it gives Jonah's story credibility. And we all of a sudden can believe Jonah's story because Jesus referenced it when he said something. That's what happens in Isaiah 7. So if you really read Isaiah 7 for yourself, which I would invite you to do that, if you really read Isaiah 7 for yourself, Isaiah 7 is a sign sent to a king because God is going to deliver a nation, Babylon, into their hands. To say nothing about Jesus. This isn't like Isaiah 53. This isn't like the 22nd Psalm. This isn't a big messianic prophecy. It's Isaiah 7. And so when we see this, and in the Hebrew, like I said, in the Hebrew, it doesn't use the word virgin. In the Hebrew, it uses the word young maiden. But when Matthew comes along, and Matthew says he's going to be born of a virgin in the town of Bethlehem, it makes Isaiah a dualistic prophecy, even though if you read Isaiah without the New Testament, you would not see it as a dualistic prophecy. It gives it credibility as a dual prophecy. So because Matthew uses it, so when you look at this and when I look at this and we think the virgin birth is the virgin birth is a big thing, don't get me wrong, but we really hinge a lot of our stuff on that virgin birth. But I don't know in Judaism if they really thought this was the cinch pin in the argument. Does that make any sense? To them, I don't know a virgin birth was the thing. But when Matthew brings it up, when Matthew brings it forward and says, oh, it's a virgin birth in the town of Bethlehem, then all of a sudden we look back at Isaiah and we say, oh, that was a dual prophecy. That was a sign from God, right? That was a sign from God. And it makes it dualistic. So when you start to talk about some of this messianic prophecy, which we're going to talk about, a lot of times the credibility of the prophecy is because of it's mentioned in the New Testament and who mentions it in the New Testament. If Jesus says it's so, then we believe it's so. We don't even argue that. Jesus says it, we believe it. Jesus says Jonah was 3 days and 3 nights in the fish. I believe Jonah was 3 days and 3 nights in the fish. I don't believe it's a wives' tale, right? I don't believe it was made up because Jesus gave it credibility. So when we look at prophecy, fulfilling prophecy, you have to not just look at the prophecy, at what was being said, and its fulfillment. You have to look at the credibility of the prophecy based on the people who are using it to make the argument that it's true. Does that make any sense? Did I lose anybody on that? You have to take it based on the credibility of the person who's using the argument to say that it's true. So when we talk about the virgin birth, which is a big thing in the Bible, I'm not saying it isn't, don't get me wrong. It's one of those prophecies out of Isaiah that if we were to look at that apart from the New Testament, we probably would not see it as a messianic prophecy, if that makes any sense. But when Matthew brings it up and restates it, then all of a sudden we're like, oh, okay, now I see. So prophecy is a tough thing. We're going to talk about quite a bit of prophecy next week. This is an interesting one. And read Isaiah 7 and you'll kind of see what I'm talking about, I think. So anyway, thanks for your time this evening.